Welcome to the Rebuilding Arizona Civics podcast. This podcast aims to share our journey of sustaining Arizona's interest in reforms to civic education by implementing the Educating for American Democracy roadmap. This work is being done by an amazing group of Arizona civic teacher leaders and overseen by the Center for Political Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. I'm your host, Liz Evans, Director of Civic Education at Arizona State University, and I'll be interviewing Arizona teachers and thought leaders in civic education. We hope you enjoy our journey to make Arizona a national civics renewal model. Today's episode is very impromptu. It just develops from a conversation. Really what we're looking at, Jeremy, our wise sage, I'm learning something. I'm literally going into this podcast episode knowing nothing about this. I've never heard of Costa's levels of questioning. I have no idea. So it's kind of fun to listen to. So what we're looking at today, again, is an actionable model of inquiry. We're not going to just talk about what it is. We're going to talk about how to do it. And I have with me Jeremy and Tara. Tara has some experience with it. And we're just going to learn about what this is and how to put this stuff into action. So, Jeremy, if you want to just kind of give us the background of how you learned about this, how you started using this, give us, a little to start with.
Yeah, sure. In 2005, I attended an AP Summer Institute for AP US History because that's what I was teaching that at the time. And the gentleman who taught the course, introduced us to this thing called levels of questions. It was this model for teaching students how to write good questions. And I'll come back to what I mean by what I've refined as the definition of a good question here in a moment. But I was fascinated by it because I think that it balanced between the concrete and the conceptual. Like I found that if you just ask students, ask questions, ask good questions, like they don't, some of them know how to ask decent questions. A lot of them don't. A lot of people don't know how to ask good questions. And again, I'll nail down the definition of good question in a moment. But I was, like I said, I was fascinated by what seemed to be this really like this golden ratio of sorts, this wonderful balance between there being very concrete, objective elements to this model, but those provided a springboard to some very highly conceptual and increasingly complex levels of thought. Sometimes if you aim too high, like if you start at the top of the Bloom's scale, you can blow people away. On the other hand, if you just dwell at the bottom, then the kids come back and people come back. And what's the complaint about history classes? Well, I just had to memorize a bunch of names and dates because that's all you did. On the other hand, if you want to deal with the big complex stuff that we all like to discuss and debate, but you don't spend time layering that foundation of factual knowledge, then it's like some tinfoil hat public access debate at 2:00 in the morning, and that's not good for anybody. So that's one of the things about the model that really that drew me in. And then over a period of years, working with some other teachers when I was still in the classroom, I refined it, added some things to it as to how I used it in the classroom. And then I realized very organically over time that I was using it and the concepts in it in lots of different ways. But it all came back to, and was all very congruent to this, what I think is a pretty simple and straightforward model. And so when I was thinking about EAD and the inquiry being so much at the foundation of it, I realized that there is a need for, again, like what you just called an actionable model. So we say inquiry is great. Well, how do I do that? And what do I do that I could say that's inquiry? And not just inquiry by me, but my students are doing inquiry. They're learning the skills and they're applying the skills and they're learning the content and they're wrestling with the ideas through it. So that's what I thought would be useful to talk about.
Tara, do you want to talk about your experience with these levels of questioning at all?
Yeah, so I actually worked a bit with Costa's levels of thinking with my students through AVID. It was a program that we had in the Mesa Public School District when I taught there. And it was introduced first to us teachers as a way to really look at how we were asking questions of our students in class. So again, there's the 3 levels of questioning. And that baseline level is really simplistic, or as it was framed to us as teachers, straight from the book. So asking your students those questions that are easily found, easily located, just kind of that like rote answer from the book. And that's that level 1 style of questioning. Level 2 starts to move students into the space where they're actually thinking themselves. So kind of beyond the book. So it's the brain in the book type of questioning, where it might have some information that needs to be located from the book, but there also needs to be a synthesis of information, maybe from other areas of the book or other resources, or even just their own knowledge. And then that level 3 questioning is really lifting everything that was learned and having the students create something of themselves, their own thinking, and synthesize all of that information together. So a really kind of simple example of this, of level 1, is just to be, asking students perhaps, name all the planets in the solar system. That is information that can be easily lifted from any resource. Level 2 might be to compare the different planets within the solar system. And as a teacher, you can decide if it's going to be all 9 or if it's going to be 2 or 3. But having students then again go across that information and do a comparison, in that they're thinking for themselves how things are either similar or different. And then when you would ask a level 3 question, that would be centering it back on the student and having them distinguish perhaps how is planet Earth a habitable planet versus others that are not habitable. So again, taking all the information that was built up in level 1 and level 2 to create that level 3 question and answer. So for my work around that, it helped me to be a better teacher, to also, when I'm writing things or posing questions in a lesson to students, really distinguishing how I'm asking students to answer that question, but then where I'm going to position, perhaps where they're getting the information from, starting off with that level 1 and graduating up to that level 3. So this framework of Acosta's thinking is something that I think as a teacher is really insightful. And I know that we have some resources that we'll be sharing out after this podcast as well, so that you can kind of see how this framework could help you with the EAD questions in your classroom.
I was going to ask you, so when you talk about you want students to learn how to write good questions, why is that important? Because aren't we supposed to be writing the questions as teachers? What is the purpose in having students be able to come up with questions on these 3 different levels?
Okay. I think that, and it absolutely makes sense that this could be used as a model, per Tara's description, to help teachers think about, well, how am I approaching students with questions? How am I myself formulating questions? How am I basing lessons on questions? Things like that. That makes sense. The challenge is, and I'll answer your question in this, how do you get the students to ask the questions? Well, why do you want the students to ask the questions? Oh, there are so many reasons. I say primarily because one day they won't be your students. They will be grown-ups, and we want them to be able to think. Look, little kids, those of us who are parents, they come out and they just don't stop asking questions, and something happens. Is it hormones? Is it pop culture? Is it the system beating the love of learning? I don't know. I'm not going to go into that, but they stop asking questions. And a lot of times the questions they ask, they're good from the standpoint of they are of interest to the child. But something happens by the time they hit middle school, definitely by the time they hit high school, from my experience, that they become dull to the idea of it, and thus they become dull in the practice of it. And getting people to be active learners is not only part habit, but it's also part skill. And, we talk a lot about, reaching students where they are. Well, think about this. If you are teaching about the post-World War II civil rights movement in the United States, and you give the kids a heap of readings and you show them a video and you give them questions, that doesn't meet them where they are. That meets them where you are. and it expects them to be able to engage with and understand the content where you start them, not where they are. They might be beyond where you assume they are. They might have misunderstandings or mischaracterizations that prevent them from even understanding the questions that you're asking of them rather. So teaching them to ask questions enables them to engage with anything you are putting in front of them immediately from where they are, which, by the way, is this wonderful formative assessment, because as you start to have the students ask not questions of you, questions of the content, you get a very strong sense, oh, that's where they are, or that's what they don't understand, or this is what I don't need to deal with because X many students already get it. But you have to teach them to write, as I said earlier, good questions. And a good question, in my mind, is one that is clear, it is precise, and it is relevant to what you're dealing with. And what I mean by clear is like, that's just grammatical. We're talking clearly worded, can be understood. So you write it on the page or you type it on the screen. I used to say this to my students, walk out of the room and someone else could walk in and look at it and say, I may not know the answer, but I know what that's asking. Precise is written in such a way that it enables the reader to actually go after what the writer of the question wants them to. You know how terrible it is when you get a vague question on a test and you want to find the person who wrote the test and like club them with it because you're like, I could answer this question, but I'm really not sure what you're asking. So the question has to be precise and it has to be relevant. Like if we're talking about the post-World War II civil rights movement and some kid wants to ask, starts asking questions about, I don't know, pancakes or something like that, and it doesn't have to do with lunch counters, it's not relevant. And those three things they're tough. I mean, think about your students and think about them as writers. Are many of them that clear and precise? Liz is shaking her head no.
They are not.
They're not.
Because they think they have to follow a formula. They're more worried about what the rubric is, what the formula is, than what they're writing.
See, this is where, like I said earlier, this model, levels of questions, which I used to abbreviate LOQ, big L, little o, big Q, LOQ, boop, write it on the board. It balances between the concrete and the abstract. So when I would teach it, I'd say level 1 questions, they exist to gather information. They seek facts. That's all a level 1 question does. In fact, one level 1 question should seek one fact only. And the tough thing is when you ask kids to write questions, you say, well, this question should help you learn things, should help you gather information. That in itself, unfortunately, is a little bit vague. So saying to them, listen, your level 1 question, it seeks a single fact. One question seeks one fact, which means it can be answered in one sentence. Boom, done. I used to also teach it with level 1s should start with who, what, where, or when. Because those are fact questions. Those are like, if you have, as Tara said, like a reference, a text, if you have a textbook, if you give them an essay or you give them a speech or something like that, they should be able to find that answer in that. And it should not be something that students are going to argue. It's right there. The Rosa Parks was arrested on this date. If that's in the essay, no one's going to argue it. When was Rosa Parks arrested? Question mark. One sentence, one question, one fact, answered in one sentence. Rosa Parks was arrested on blank date. Period. So it's super concrete. Level 2 questions, I'd say, have to start with how or why. And those then, they seek either your how questions. Now, oftentimes we in conversation use those words interchangeably, but in order to drive home the value of precision, I'd say, look, how seeks process or means by which, why asks for reason or rationale. So you differentiate between those a bit. And I used to say, look, a level 2 question, yeah, sure, you could write an essay. Why did World War II happen? You could write a book. You could have a whole life on that. But I'd say, listen, if I've given you some reading or you watched a video, or you listened to a lecture. Like that is, you've been exposed to a block of content. You should be able to answer a level 2 question, a how or why question in a couple sentences, two to three sentences. And as Tara, as you alluded to before, there's a connection. There's a very clean interplay between these levels. A level 1 question is just facts. Level 2 questions lasso those facts together. Level 2 questions attach the facts together and do something with them. So for example, if you have an essay about that post-World War II civil rights movement that talks about some of the major moments in the 1950s and major people, you've established maybe who Rosa Parks is and Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery, think blah, 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 what segregation was, stuff like that. And now you start to you cluster that pile of facts that you have extracted from that block of content and formalized into level 1 questions. You're clustering them with those level 2 questions, which then enables you to establish some degree of context and start to process and interpret information. Now, one thing that students will either get confused by or try to get over on teachers with is they will phrase a counting question, a numerical question, as a how question, because they'll say how many. That's a cheap shot. That is the one rule breaker that counts as a level 1, because that's seeking a fact. So, and then level 3 questions, your analytical, evaluative, synthetic questions that typically aren't, if I were going to have students write questions about a block of text, like our set of readings, I would not have them, rather the level 3 question would not necessarily be about the text, but would be in reaction to the text. So level 1 and level 2, you can use those to have the students, quote unquote, master the content. And then level 3 is more react to and respond to and build upon.
So what I'm hearing and what I wrote down is essentially these questions are meeting the students where they are, as opposed to catching them in what they don't know. Yeah. Because the entire purpose of inquiry, like when you said, when was Rosa Parks arrested? I can give you the year, but I couldn't give you the date because, it's just not in my brain. But allowing them to engage in something they know might make them want to go deeper, might make them want to ask questions of, why was it Rosa Parks that was arrested? Like, were there other people there? And creating more of this cycle of, this is really what history and civics and social studies is, right? Is learning and inquiry. And we get new facts, we get new data, we get new perspectives. It's constantly growing and changing. So by teaching them how to write good questions, we're essentially teaching them how to be good citizens.
Yeah.
Because when they get older, they're asking questions like, I wonder who's funding this, leaflet that I got and what they stand for and, what this kind of stuff means. So what does this look like then? So again, I am just learning about all of this and you've both used this. If I'm a teacher, regardless of grade level, right? Because really kindergarten, when I think about kindergarten, I think about when my child was kindergartner and why was everything out of her mouth? Why? Because she just genuinely wanted to know all of these things. How can any teacher start doing this in their class? And then what challenges might they face with that? So even if they just, want to go into the classroom tomorrow and say, I just want to see how this works, what does that look like?
It requires an investment of time and effort. Here's the problem. Here is the problem with this. If you want your kids to be able to ask good questions, you have to teach them this model. You must then assess their understanding of and proficiency with the model, and then you have to commit to reinforcing it in order that they get better at it. Like, football teams don't just have football games. The vast majority of their time is spent in practice that we the fans never see. If you want to have that killer Socratic seminar where kids are asking questions you didn't ask of, and you're like, oh my you have to sink in the time to do it. You have to sink that time in. And so what I used to do is I would teach it to them using something goofy like a fairy tale, like any Disney fairy tale or any movie that like everybody has seen. No, I'm serious, because it disarmed them a little bit, because it wasn't like, by not giving it to them in wrapped around the content, it didn't seem as intimidating. It was kind of goofy and they giggled a little bit and whatnot. But I would say, all right, like everyone knows the story of Little Mermaid, right? Ish. Most people sort of kind of Little Mermaid. And I'd put the kids in groups and I'd say, all right, first off, level 1 questions. What's a level 1 question? It starts with who, what, where, when. It's only one of those 4 questions unless it's how many. Level 2 questions are only how or why. And level 3 question is like, you had this weird thought in reflection or reflecting on this content. You had this like, made me think about this. I wouldn't spend too much time initially on the level 3s because they're really complex. I wanted to nail down rather the first 2. So I put the kids in small groups and I say, all right, write 5 level 1 questions each in your group about the Little Mermaid. And then what I would do is go around and have them compare with one another and then share out from their group. Like that everyone knows how to do that. That's an easy model. That is a super easy model. Now, the key here though, and this is where I've seen teachers fall down with this, and then the model doesn't work and you wonder why it doesn't work. Well, because you didn't put in the time. Here's what you need to do. You need to make sure they understand the model, and I guarantee you they won't. So what you do is you say, all right, 5 level 1 questions related to the Little Mermaid. And you take a few from each group and you write them on the board, or you project them on the screen, or whatever it is, so everyone can see them. And the job that you're doing here is you are going to drive home how to phrase the question. And I kept using the language, a properly phrased level 1 question or a properly phrased level 2 question. Like, you hammer down the concrete side of the model first before trying to do anything cool with it. It's like when you sit someone down, you teach them to drive a car. Like you show them what like the most important like buttons, dials, and switches do first before you have them turn the key, and then take them somewhere in it. So why don't you two give me like 1 or 2 what you would think level 1 questions? Remember, who, what, where, when, for the Little Mermaid. I'm putting you on the spot.
Who is the Little Mermaid?
Okay, who's the Little Mermaid? Totally valid.
Where does the Little Mermaid live?
Where's the Little Mermaid live? What's another one?
What does the Little Mermaid want?
Okay, what is the Little Mermaid? Okay, so I've got 3. Who is the Little Mermaid? Where does the Little Mermaid live? And what does the Little Mermaid want? All right. Now here's what I would say first. Are they properly phrased? So in other words, do they fit the model of a level 1 question? Do they start with one of those 4 interrogatives? Who, what, where, when? Okay, so we check that box off. We're good to go with that. Are they clear and precise? Who is the Little Mermaid? Is that clear and precise? Given the context of the Little Mermaid story, there's really one answer to that. She's the daughter of King Triton, blase, blase. Okay. Now, what about that next one? Where does the Little Mermaid, what does she want, or where does she live?
Live.
Okay, where does the Little Mermaid live? Is that clear? Is that a bit vague? Could that be answered correctly 2 different ways?
It could be answered correctly a lot of different ways. Like, are we talking about countries? Are we talking about...
Little Mermaid doesn't live in a country. Come on now.
Little Mermaid is a Danish story.
But it never says that she's from there. So, look, here's the trouble.
Ocean.
Okay, but the problem is, though, someone watching, say, the movie would say, yeah, but she lives on land for part of it. So
is she visiting?
Okay, like, where is the Little Mermaid's home? Okay, where does you could say where does she want to go in this? I'm not that vague too. The point is, you're trying to train the students to recognize the value of precision in word choice. because you don't want a level one question that can be answered correctly 2 or more ways. What does the Little Mermaid want? Is that a little vague?
Very deep question.
It's a way deep question. It is, but she wants legs. She wants love. She wants a dingle hopper or whatever the thing is called that she curls her hair up with, or something like that. She wants lots of different things. So the problem with that question is that it's vague. So what I would do is I would go through and I would help the students wordsmith and massage the language so as to focus and like, well, what are you getting at with your question? Okay, let's work on as a class wording that so that it is as a level one question. There's no doubt as to what you're asking. And that is tremendously valuable, because if you get your kids used to being precise in their language, woo, won't that help in their writing and their explanation of things? I would do the same thing with level 2 questions. So what would be, give me one each. What's a level 2 question for the Little Mermaid?
Well, before we start this, I do want to say, like, when I'm thinking about writing, because that's every teacher I feel like has their place where they shine. And I feel like I shined as a writing teacher because I taught English too, but that is very much the identify. So if you're teaching AP government, or I mean, really any of the AP studies, right? Identify is that. It is just the quick answer the question. So all of these, like, as you're talking, I'm like, it's just another way to think about these things. But anyway, back to the Little Mermaid, the Disney movie that I hate the most.
Although Little Mermaid does have the second most brave prince in it. I'll argue that later. So give me your how or why question.
I was going to say, I'm going to need some evidence, but I'll wait for a well-worded email with all of your evidence points and a counterclaim. Why does Little Mermaid want legs?
Okay. Oh, and here's a cool thing. Remember how I said how level 2 questions rope together level 1 facts? That question doesn't make any sense to someone if they don't know who the Little Mermaid is, or the fact that she's a mermaid and she doesn't have legs. How about you, Tara?
Why does the Little Mermaid go to visit the sea witch, Ursula?
Oh yeah, good call. Again, there are story elements, and there are facts, and there are ideas and themes, teenage rebellion, in that story that are implied in that question, that if they'd been introduced as level 1 facts, or they were in the passage that the students read about the story, or if they watched the Disney movie, that question implies. But also we have some facts there. We have Ursula, we have her going back underwater, being underwater. We have all these things. And you both asked why questions. So, and you can see where both your questions sought a rationale. Like, what is your reason behind doing this or wanting this? Whereas if you asked, how is it that the Little Mermaid ended up mute? That's not rationale. There's a process. There's a means by which that happened. So there's a little bit of a difference there. Again, I would go around and ask, and we would put those up on the board and make sure that they were A, properly phrased, and B, clear. And then there's the question of, is this relevant to our study of this? And what I used to ask my students is, listen, if you read this thing or watched this thing, or, here's this thing that you could know about, what questions would you want to answer to demonstrate that you know what you're talking about in relation to this thing? Now, they might not know anything about it at that point, but everybody has a sense as a student, especially by high school, which is what I had. Everyone has a sense of, like, how do I demonstrate how I know about something? And reminding them of that, I found useful. But anyway, what I would then have them do is I would give them a short, like, after I felt like they kind of had an idea of it, is I would give them a short passage, something relevant to the course, content-wise, like a short essay, maybe 2 or 3 pages at most. And I would tell them to write 6 level 1 questions, 3 level 2 questions, and 1 level 3 question. And it was always a pyramid. The facts got the biggest base, then we got smaller as we went up to the top. And I'd say, you need to write the question, you need to write the answer. And then that was homework after I taught them the model. They come in the next day and we did the exact same thing again. I would have them compare among themselves. I would have them each go up on the board, like during bell work, and everyone would write each of their questions on the board, blocked off. So I would have all these anonymous questions rather, on the board. And then we as a class would spend the day going through them. And again, is it properly phrased? Is it precise? Do we think it's relevant? And in that instance, you have the opportunity to drive home that idea of like linguistic precision and clarity, and also how do you then focus on a topic? And that's something I would have to revisit periodically. And it's like you have to give up half a class period, or you have to give up a class period to do it. But the only way that they're going to get good at it is if you revisit it like that. So after I felt like they were at least proficient, like I could give them an assignment, I could have them watch a documentary, or I could have them read a passage or read part of a book or something like that and write a certain number of questions, I'd throw them for a loop and I'd say, just write the questions. I would not have them write the answers. And I got to tell you, I know one of the biggest challenges I used to have is assigning readings. If you just say, read this, the vast majority of your kids won't. If you say, read this and answer these questions, like lame questions that are in a textbook, they hunt and fish for the nouns, and you get these kind of proto answers, right? So the question is, how do I get my kids to read this stuff? But how do I get them to read it that's in a way that's more than just scanning their eyes over the text? So I'd say to the students, all right, you're going to read this, and then you're going to write this many level 1, this many level 2, this many level 3. And like I said, after a while, after I felt like they were reasonably proficient at the model, I would say, you don't have to write the answers. And they felt like they were winning because they were doing half the work. And these are the questions I've written. And what I would typically do, like if I had, not typically, always, if it was based on a reading, I would tell them, like I would look at, say it's a 3-page essay, and I've gone and picked out, there may be like 10 or 12 key facts. I would say you have to write 7 level 1 questions, which forces them to cut. And I'd say you have to pick out the 7 most important facts and the 3 most important ideas with your level 2 questions. You get a very clear view, I felt, about what they were thinking, based on what they were asking. And those kinds of assignments also, I think, were helpful because, again, it had the students getting in the habit of reading for a purpose and writing something precise. And there were times where students would turn things in. It was very clear to me. What they didn't understand, or if they were really lost because the questions they were asking were just completely off base, or they thought they understood, but they clearly did not because of the nature of the questions they were asking, especially like the level 2 questions. They just didn't know what was going on. So again, as an assignment to accompany reading, or if your students are going to listen to a lecture or they're going to watch a documentary and they take notes and then you have them write questions based on it. Again, the largest share, like it should be something like 60, maybe 60, 30, 10 percentages, level 1, level 2, level 3. Another thing I would have them do before we had exams or before we had formal assessments of different sorts is I would ask them to go back in their notes and write more questions of various sorts that would serve as their review instrument. Instead of me creating a review for them, why not let them create their own review, a note sheet to use in a structured review, but it was based on what they didn't know or what they thought was most important. And again, just because the student thinks it's most important doesn't necessarily mean that it is, but at least you put them in a position where they're asserting something and then they can turn to the text or turn to the resource and try to explain and defend why.
Like, honestly, what I found to be helpful, I mean, and this is obviously something teachers are going to have to look at with their own eyes, are those like questioning levels that have like sentence starters. And those are super helpful for your ELLs, SPED students, really for elementary age students. So having those sentence frames are helpful. And there is actually in those pages that we used, I know Jeremy picked Little Mermaid, but one of the avid pages on Costa's thinking, actually, we used Cinderella. So
that's how I was taught it.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the fairy tale spin on that. But to that point, Jeremy, I mean, we used all kinds of fairy tales and, Little Red Riding Hood and whatever kind of struck kids' fancies. They went ahead and picked, and then we used that same type of activity where they wrote their own questions and whatnot. So feel free to share this resource with teachers because it is straight out of the Avid book. And I think provides a lot of kind of baseline resources to get teachers' feet wet around what these levels of questioning are.
And something that I found over time is that initially I saw it as a way to get students to read and read more closely because they were reading for a purpose. And the degree of recall and the level of understanding that my students got out of reading secondary and primary sources over time with this was so much better than just saying outline it or summarize it. Because when you ask students, well, read this passage and summarize it. And then you ask them, well, what are you going to do when you summarize it? Well, I'm going to put down the important stuff. Like, how do you know what's important? And then they just stare at you. I mean, there are structural tells in writing, like topic sentences and things like that, transition words, junk like that. But saying to them, you need to write 5 level 1 questions. And for those 5 level 1 questions, you need to pick out the 5 most important facts in that passage. It gives them something to be predatory about. And whether they're thinking about it or not, they're actually thinking about what they're reading as they're reading, because they get this list of facts and they go, well, which one? There are 10. But I can only write 5 questions, and there are only 5 questions, 1 fact per question. I have to leave out 5. And then you instantly have the grounds for a conversation, a discussion about, well, why did you leave out that, but you included that? That's thinking, or at least it's giving them an opportunity to start thinking about thinking, even though they don't realize that that's what they're doing. What I found over time is that when they became at least like baseline proficient, the concept of level 1 and level 2 became pervasive in my classes. I would have students, like this was months into the year, we'd have a discussion in class, and I'd say to the students, that was a really good like level 2 idea, but where is your level 1 evidence? And everybody understood what I meant by it. It became comments that I wrote in the margins of students' papers. It became something I could remind them of, like when we were going into a Socratic seminar. Hey, listen, you need to come prepared with questions. You shouldn't be asking level 1 questions in a Socratic seminar. If you have a question about the passage you're reading, you should find that question. You should find an answer to that before you show up. A Socratic seminar should be level 2 and level 3 questions. Oh, okay. Like we don't need to just sit here and trade facts. Showing up prepared for a seminar means you've already nailed down the level 1 stuff. We're dwelling at the upper levels during this exercise. And so that like I said, there's the concrete side to this, but there's also like a conceptual springboard that enables you to move upward to more complex thinking, because you've got there's that concrete enough side of it that you can turn students back to and give them examples. So what I did is I wrote up a couple of pages about this, and I've got a link, and we'll include that so that people can review it. But yeah, teaching your kids have to be able to ask questions. And in fact, their questions are more important than your questions, I would argue. And you can guide the quality and direction of their questions by returning commentary about their questions to them. And they'll end up asking the questions that you actually want them to ask, but then they've asked them, they have ownership. And then one of the wonderful things too, and I wrote this up in my little piece that we'll share, I would poach good questions from students all the time. And students would be so tickled when their question would show up on an exam. They're like, I wrote that. I'm like, yeah, it's a good question. There are only just so many good questions I can ask you about the post-World War II civil rights movement. You asked one of them. It's a good question. Why should I think of my own? I took yours. And they're so happy about that. But they've written a good question, so why not?
I think that's a really good point that you brought up as well, that it's not just students who are learning how to write their own good questions, but by learning how to write and really decipher, as you said, like the exact language and preciseness around these questions, they do better in being able to answer these questions as well, which of course comes in handy, in your own classroom lessons. Credit seminar is a great space to exercise these different questions that students had written themselves. But then also when it does come time for exams, whether they are the exams you're administering in your own class or more high stakes exams, I found that students are better able to decipher what is this question really asking me to do. And so I think that there's this like kind of twofold beauty behind learning how to both read and write their own questions, because it is going to serve, I think, a broader purpose. And I do attest that it is fun to, as you said, poach questions from students, because there were multiple times as well where I would take a student's question and, include it in exam or even, in a different class and say this was written, by one of your peers in, period 2 and have them answer that question. And so that was always something I think that was empowering to students, was to see that their own question was then used to help others learn.
I love too that you talked about you using student questions to ask other questions, because it makes them feel like what they're doing in the classroom has relevance. It's not just something to check a box or whatever else.
Well, and one of the things that's said in EAD is the idea of the we're educating for American democracy. We can argue over the fact that we're a republic or whatever, blah blah, that kind of thing. But what we're trying to do is educate people in the ideas and the habits and the practices of active citizenship. And if students are only exposed to this content while sitting silently and regurgitating upon command, that's not what a citizen is supposed to do. A citizen shouldn't engage with his or her government passively. And yet we train and we condition students to be that if we don't put them in the driver's seat and make them do that. So, teaching kids how to ask questions, it blows the door wide open. And to be perfectly honest, it takes front end work, and it takes effort to continue to reinforce it. But I found that like no later than the end of the first quarter, but basically everybody got it. And then you spend the rest of the year reaping the benefits from this conceptual framework and these skills and these growing habits. But it takes that time up front. And then you have, like I said, you can do these cool things like Socratic seminars. You can do classroom debates that are actual thoughtful debates.
So I wrote this down, and tell me if I'm on the right track here. So the purpose of this is to expose students to what it's like to be an engaged student in our government, giving them practice and guidance in order to empower them.
Yeah. I hate the word empower.
Why?
Hate it. It's just jargon. It's like excellence. I'm empowering you. Well, yeah, but then that means it's rooted in me. More
What
like I'm reminding you. Huh?
What word would you use?
I don't know. Like more, I think of more like you're a citizen in this context. Like you have as much stake in this as I do. And when you hit 18, you have the same legal stake in it. And so I'm not empowering you. I'm not like granting this to you. I'm reminding you of what you have and helping you develop the desire to use it. I don't know. It's like when people say, well, government gave me these rights. No, it didn't. Government's there to protect those rights. And that may seem like being pedantic with language, but I think there's meaning in the difference.
I don't know. I kind of like empower because of the root of it.
I won't fight you for it. You can use it all you want.
There's definitely power differential, right? Like everywhere. in classrooms. And so I feel when, as an educator, you're empowering students, you are kind of breaking down that kind of hierarchy or like power structure that's traditionally rooted in that, like, as we talked about, sage on the stage or sit and get type of education. And you're giving up some of your power to the students to then, as you had already framed, practice and engage and prepare themselves to be,
I can see that.
citizens post high school. Yeah. I mean, legally, as we talked about. Yeah. So I think the root of it is what I like about the word. It is used a lot of times. I do agree in jargon. Yep. But I think used in the right like tense and the right context, then it fits.
But you know what? If there's some empowerment left, you can have it. You don't have to fight me for it. So I grant that to you.
And we just showed what a great civil discourse is. It's like, well, I disagree. And here's this, but that's, I mean, truly, how many times has a student heard this? Heard like, I don't, you just never know.
You're not going to include this in the final episode, are you?
Yeah, I am. I'm including the whole thing. All of
channeling our inner Foucault on power structure.
Thank you for listening. You can find the Center for Political Thought and Leadership on social media channels. Please subscribe to our podcast wherever you find your favorite podcast. And on a last note, the views and opinions expressed on this podcast do not necessarily represent the Center for Political Thought and Leadership or Arizona State University.